Welcome to my channel. We invite you to watch a video with our new original story. In the morning, Grace jolted awake, looking around in fear, not understanding what was happening. And what was happening was this. Her husband, Richard, was thrashing in his sleep, waving his arms as if grabbing at something, and rasping hoarsely, "Gold. It's my gold. More gold. Oh great, that's going to leave a bruise," Grace mumbled, rubbing her smarting cheek. The girls at work would laugh. What? Getting into fights now? Grace tried to wake her husband gently. But what was the use? He was flailing his arms and kicking his legs so fiercely it was scary to approach him. While his wife was trying to find a way to get to Richard, he was in a blissful dream, shoveling heaps of gold coins and nuggets into chests. Mountains of gold glittered in the desert, heating up under the hot sun. In the midst of the treasures stood a sphinx, calling to him in a terrible voice. "You have 5 minutes left to fill your chests with gold. Whatever you can take is yours." And Richard was making it. He worked with all his might, scooping the searing gold into a huge chest with his bare hands, constantly glancing at the enormous hourglass standing next to the Sphinx. He was terribly thirsty, his throat parched, but he had to keep shoveling the gold. If only I had a shovel, Richard thought with regret, and, drenched in sweat, began to scoop even faster. But then the Sphinx approached him and said in a painfully familiar female voice, "Honey, wake up, it's time for work." "I don't want to go to the office," Richard answered resentfully. "I have gold now, and there are still 2 minutes left. It's not fair. Then what do you want?" "Water," Richard yelled, his voice turning dry. "Water it is, then." With a wild scream, Richard shot up in bed, instantly awake, feeling his wet face in pajamas. His wife stood over him with a pitcher of water, barely holding back her laughter. "Where am I?" Richard squeaked pitifully, his eyes rolling in confusion. "Where's the gold? You should drink less." Grace laughed and ruffled her husband's wet hair. "You almost gave me a black eye. What were you guys doing at that corporate gala? Swimming in a pool of champagne? You were completely wasted last night. Don't tell me how to live. Just make me some strong coffee," Richard mumbled, clutching his head. "Already made it." "Drink this. It'll be easier," and Grace handed her husband a glass of water in which a life-saving hangover relief tablet was fizzing. "Water," Richard groaned and drained the glass in one gulp. "If you knew the kind of deal that's coming my way, you wouldn't be laughing at me right now. I'm going to be a gold tycoon." "A what?" Grace asked, and just in case, placed a palm on Richard's forehead. It was cool. Richard frowned and pulled away from his wife's hand. "This is what—" "Yesterday at the gala, I met a very reputable gold prospector. He's selling a large plot of land, packed with gold. Do you understand what a profitable deal this is?" Grace looked at her husband skeptically and handed him his coffee. "If it's so profitable, why doesn't he keep the land for himself? And with what money are you going to buy this plot?" "All our money is tied up in the business." Richard took a sip of the fragrant coffee and replied, "Good question, Grace. Arthur, the gold prospector I was telling you about, already has a couple of similar plots, and he doesn't need a third. He said he wants to gradually retire and spend the rest of his life on some paradise island. But I've already thought about it and decided that I need a change too. So today I'm selling my business and investing the money in gold mining. True, that money won't be enough to buy such a profitable plot. I'll take out a loan from the bank." Grace plopped into an armchair in shock. "But that's such a risk, buying something from God knows who. Aren't you afraid? What's there to be afraid of? Everything is transparent and, moreover, confirmed by documents. If you knew how the price of gold is rising, you wouldn't be talking like that. You should be supporting your husband in his endeavor, not shaking your body over here, eating pastries again. You'll blow up like a hippo." Grace flinched. Every time her husband got angry at her words, he hit a sore spot. Grace was an attractive young woman, but slightly too curvy for her husband's standards. To some, she might have seemed a true beauty. Luxurious curves, a thick mane of black hair, regular features, and eyes as big and blue as the sea. Men would turn to look at Grace, but not her husband, who thought she could stand to lose some weight and quit her beloved profession as a pastry chef. Not pastries, gourmet chocolate-filled croissants, she replied, offended. Better hurry, or the hippo will gobble them all up and leave none for you. As if. Richard scoffed and went to the kitchen. In general, Richard had always considered himself a calculating man, and was proud of it. His marriage to Grace was, for him, nothing more than a successful business deal. At one time, he had been dating 2 girls simultaneously, who lived in different parts of the city and had no idea of each other's existence. And when the cunning suitor had to choose, he settled on the curvy Grace, not the tall beauty Jessica. And it wasn't because he particularly liked the quiet and slightly absent-minded Grace, quite the opposite. It was simply that Grace's parents were offering a substantial dowry, while Jessica didn't have a penny to her name. So he had to say goodbye to Jessica. "You're leaving me?" Jessica was stunned by Richard's betrayal. "But why?" "I'm sorry. You're magnificent," the young man shrugged. "But love is love, and a man's gotta eat. I'm as poor as a church mouse, and so are you. It would be tough for us together, so get smart and find a rich guy." A sharp slap echoed through the hallway of the dorm where Jessica lived, and Richard, having received payment for his villainy, turned and walked toward the exit, whistling a cheerful tune. He didn't care about the feelings of the rejected girl. After all, a wedding with a wealthy bride awaited him. A year after the wedding, Grace's parents died in a rock slide in the mountains, a potential slide that their son-in-law was well aware of but had failed to warn his relatives about. After the funeral, the newlyweds moved from their rented apartment into the cozy home of Grace's family. Richard, unlike his grieving wife, was on cloud 9, carefully masking his joy. And 6 months later, he had completely taken over Grace's father's small lumber business, significantly expanding it later on. And now, sitting in his office, he dreamed of a new venture that literally promised him mountains of gold. Richard's rosy dreams were interrupted by a knock on the door. A pretty secretary peeked in to announce the long-awaited guests. "They're here for you, Mr. Thompson." "Of course, you fool. I gave you all the instructions." Richard nervously adjusted his tie, but only made it worse. Now his tie was completely crooked. 3 people entered the office with an air of importance. 2 men, one of whom was Arthur, whom Richard had met at the gala, and a young woman. She walked ahead of the others and was a drop-dead gorgeous beauty. An elegant leather pantsuit, her hair cascading in golden waves to her waist, and a face as beautiful as a Greek goddess's. Richard looked into her eyes and was dumbfounded. Standing before him, smiling condescendingly, was Jessica, the very same girl from the poor neighborhood whom he had so ruthlessly abandoned. "Recognize me, Richie?" she smirked, enjoying her former fiancé's stupor. "Jessica, look at you, such a powerful lady. I barely recognize you, simply beautiful." Richard's heart pounded like a drum. "Let's get down to business, Richard. We didn't come here to listen to compliments, but to do business." "Are you in or not?" Jessica interrupted, stepping so close to him that he could smell the fragrance of her hair. "I'm in," Richard forced out, still in a bit of a shock from the unexpected reunion. "Boys, your turn," Jessica commanded, and sank gracefully into a chair. "I'll just look over your documents in the meantime, just in case you try to slip me a fake." Jessica laughed, but there was a bitter edge to her laughter, and Richard swore to himself that he would beg the beauty's forgiveness, no matter what it cost him. Especially since his heart, remembering the past, was burning with a passion, signaling that the old flame had been rekindled. The 2 men who had come with her sat down at the negotiation table and began to talk about the advantages of gold mining and its immense profitability. Arthur was the most enthusiastic, showing a presentation of his proposal. "And how do I know you're not leading me on, my friends?" Richard asked, narrowing his eyes. "My lawyers will thoroughly review the deal. You can't deceive me. Besides, I'll send my assistant to the mine site." The older man exclaimed indignantly, "How can you say that? We even brought a sample of a gold nugget from the very plot we're selling you. It was found at a shallow depth, which means that if we start development, there will be more gold, and a lot of it. Here is a certificate from the State Assay Office, confirming that this sample was found on that exact plot." And Arthur, the owner of the gold mines, took a small wooden box and a document with an official seal from his briefcase. "If you're not planning to buy, we'll go to other interested parties," Jessica purred. "We're not some kind of beggars," Richard, intoxicated by her attention and charm, opened the box and took out the nugget. The gold sparkled in the light, causing an avaricious glint in his eyes. "Wow, this must be at least 200 grams," he said admiringly, tossing the nugget in his hand. Richard skimmed what was written in the certificate, glancing repeatedly at Jessica, who had settled gracefully in the chair and was looking languidly at her former fiancé. "Don't get distracted, Richie. Read the paper, or we might just trick you," she flirted with Richard. At these words, both of her companions jumped up from their chairs in indignation. Richard started coughing, having choked on his own saliva. "Jessie, how can you joke with the man like that?" the second man said cautiously. "It's fine. He'll live, right, darling?" And Jessica leaned forward, hinting at their old feelings to Richard. Poor Richard, breaking out in a cold sweat, was torn between two desires: to get fabulously rich and to be with the stunning beauty once again. He wanted both, and so, understanding that buying the profitable business would make him attractive to Jessica, he signed the contract to purchase the plot along with the nearby mines, which the old owner was selling for a bargain. There was almost no gold left in those mines, but there was equipment that was worth a lot of money. "You're saving a considerable amount on this, you sly fox," the now former owner of the plots and mines joked. When they were celebrating the deal in a restaurant, Jessica sat next to Richard, which sent shivers down his spine. After the gathering, a tipsy Richard was already hugging his business partners like old friends. When they parted ways, Jessica took Richard's hand and, looking into his eyes, asked languidly, "Maybe you'll stay with me?" "But I'm married," Richard mumbled, secretly delighted at the suggestion. "Still with that chubby girl?" Jessica burst into wild laughter and kissed him. Richard nodded guiltily and hugged his old friend. "Let's fly to the islands," Jessica exclaimed. "You have your passport with you, right?" "Why? We live in a resort area. The sea is right here." Jessica put her hands on her hips and narrowed her eyes. "What? Is that wedding ring weighing you down?" "Clipped your wings, have they, my handsome eagle? Well, have a nice life then." And she turned to leave forever, gorgeous and bold, the complete opposite of Richard's wife. "Wait, I can go for a couple of days. I'll say it's an urgent business trip for the new venture." Richard stood there, looking pleadingly into Jessica's eyes. "All right, then buy your ticket, and I'll see you at the airport." Jessica laughed and walked away, leaving Richard in sweet anticipation of their meeting. He didn't remember how he got home, fell into bed with his shoes still on, and fell asleep. In the morning, he woke up in his pajamas. That Grace had carefully changed him while he was dancing with Jessica in his sleep. 2 days later, Richard flew to the islands for a whole week, having lied to his wife that the trip was related to surveying the gold-bearing plot. And, as usual, she packed her husband's suitcase herself and checked if he had all his documents, while Richard was having the time of his life with his mistress, who had completely clouded his judgment. An unexpected inheritance fell upon Grace. A lawyer showed up at her workplace. "Are you Grace Thompson, née Miller?" the gray-haired woman in a strict tweed suit asked sternly. "Yes." "What happened?" Grace asked, frightened. "How do you know my maiden name?" The lawyer, apparently used to such reactions, explained everything calmly and clearly, sitting down on a chair near the window. "I am the lawyer for your great-aunt, Rose Miller. Do you know of her?" "Yes, she's my dad's cousin, but I don't remember her at all. My parents didn't really keep in touch with her for some reason, or she with them, I'm not sure," Grace answered, flustered. "That's no longer important, because your aunt recently passed away, leaving you a small fortune and a villa on the seashore, 3 kilometers from here." "But why me?" Grace was in shock. "I'm sorry about my aunt. I didn't even know she had passed." The lawyer handed her the documents. "Sign here to accept the inheritance. I think this letter will answer your question." The lawyer handed her documents to sign and an envelope with her aunt's letter. Grace signed the documents, certifying that the luxurious villa now belonged to her. When the lawyer left, Grace, still not believing what was happening, opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter and an old black and white photo. "Who is this? She looks so much like me." Grace curiously examined the photograph. It showed a boy and a girl, about 10 years old, standing on top of a hill. The photographer had captured them in the moment they laughingly threw their sun hats into the air, with the sea behind them. Grace recognized the boy immediately. It was her father. But the girl was her spitting image, only with shorter braids. On the back of the photograph, in ink, was written, "Dima and Rosie, being happy." Suddenly, Grace's heart clenched with pain. She remembered her father, so kind and cheerful, who had left this world so early. She pressed the precious photo to her chest and whispered, "Dad, I love you so much. I miss you and Mom so much." Tears welled up in her eyes, and Grace had to drink some water to calm herself down. She unfolded the letter and began to read. "Dear niece, forgive me for reminding you of myself in such a sad way. The author of this letter is just a big coward and a world-class snob who is afraid to take the first step. When your father, my cousin, passed away, I realized what a foolish thing I had done by not being a part of your lives. And now, on my deathbed, I regret only one thing, that I missed out on happy times with my family. You probably don't even remember me. The last time I saw you, you were 2 years old, and then your father and I stopped speaking, and it was all because of my greed. We couldn't agree on our grandmother's inheritance, after whom you were named. I deceitfully took her inheritance and a plot of land. I built a luxurious villa, but it didn't bring me happiness. I remained alone. Therefore, everything I have, I am passing on to you, Gracie. I hope your dad will forgive me when we meet in heaven, and I can look him in the eye without shame. Live happily, my dear, and don't let anyone push you around. Your Aunt Rose." Grace couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She sobbed, burying her face in the letter. "Gracie, are you okay?" Her colleague and friend Chloe peeked into the office. "No, my aunt died, and I didn't even get to say goodbye," Grace replied through her sobs. "It turns out she lived not far from me, needed my help, and I knew nothing about it." Chloe put an arm around her friend's shoulders and suddenly burst into tears herself. "What are you crying for?" Grace asked, sniffling. "I feel bad for you." So they wept, holding each other, until the head of the pastry department came in and, just in case, sent them both home. He couldn't stand women's tears. Tear-streaked and with red noses, the two friends were riding in a taxi to Grace's house when Chloe suddenly clapped her hands and said, "Gracie, let's go see your villa right now." "What?" Grace was surprised. "Why wait? Let's go." Chloe, patting the taxi driver on the shoulder, asked, "Sir, can you turn around? We need to go in the other direction now." The taxi driver, who was long past being surprised by anything, whistled and cheerfully replied, "Anything you want for your money, ladies." "Hooray! We're going to the villa!" the friends exclaimed in unison and laughed. The taxi driver thought to himself, "Women." They were very close to the villa when the road split. "Now where?" asked the taxi driver. "Where to? Right or left? There are no signs." "Go right, you'll get rich. Go left, you'll get married," the cheerful Chloe blurted out. The taxi driver didn't get the joke and got angry. "Listen, ladies, I'm not going to play guessing games with you here. Pay the fare and get out. My cab isn't moving another inch. Do whatever you want after that. Get rich, get married. I don't care. I need to get home. My wife is waiting for me for dinner." Grace paid the driver, and the friends got out of the car. "What are we going to do?" Chloe asked quietly, cursing her big mouth. "We'll walk," Grace replied, squinting in the sun. "What do you mean, walk?" Chloe asked, surprised. "On her own 2 feet? That's how," Grace laughed. "Then let's ask someone," Chloe suggested. "Look, there's an old man on a bike, probably a local. We can ask him." The old man turned out to be a rather pleasant elderly gentleman who spoke to them first, stopping his old bicycle next to the women. "Good day, ladies. Where are you beautiful young women from?" he asked, getting off his bicycle and taking off his hat. "Hello, sir," Grace greeted him. "I'm looking for my Aunt Rose's villa. It was left to me in her will. Could you tell us which way to go?" The old man stopped and whistled, fixing an inquisitive gaze on the young woman's face. "So, you must be Vera," the owner's niece. Well, aren't you a beauty? A pleasure to meet you. I'm Samuel Jenkins. I used to work for your late aunt. Looked after the property, the house, and the garden. There's a ton of work, and everything needs looking after. The missus, a kind soul, paid me a year in advance before she passed, so that everything would be handed over to you in perfect condition. If you don't mind an old man like me, I'll continue to look after the estate. Of course, please stay. I'd be glad, Grace said, hugging the old man in a rush of emotion. He beamed with a satisfied smile and said, "Then go left. It's not far. I'll hurry ahead, open the gate, and put the kettle on. Your aunt had a whole collection of teas. I have some sandwiches with me. My wife packed them to keep me company. I'll share them with you." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Chloe shouted after him and turned her face to the sea breeze. "It's so nice here. We just have to climb this hill." From a distance, Grace recognized the place. It was from the photograph her Aunt Rose had left her. When they saw the villa, they were speechless for a moment. It was Grace's crystal dream come true. A snow-white villa seemed to crown the hilltop, surrounded by cascading terraces that descended the slope. Tall, arched windows, like attentive eyes, faced the sea and sparkled with colorful stained glass. The stone walls contrasted with the terracotta roof tiles, creating an effect of impenetrability. It seemed as if every stone had absorbed the warmth of the midday sun and the coolness of the sea breezes. The friends, holding their breath, entered through the gates, opened by Mr. Jenkins, and found themselves among blooming magnolias and citrus groves. The air was filled with the scents of roses and the sea breeze, which carried the cries of seagulls. "Oh my goodness," Chloe whispered and hugged a rose bush to inhale its fragrance. "I'm going to faint." "Is this really happening to me?" Grace asked breathlessly. "Don't faint, we still have to see the house." Chloe took Grace's arm and pulled her onto the terrace. The largest terrace offered a panorama worthy of the gods. The sea, like a painter's canvas, changed shades from deep blue to turquoise, merging with the horizon in a gentle haze. "Maybe we should stay here tonight?" Chloe asked in a pleading tone. "We will," Grace answered and took a deep breath. She finally felt at home. In the evening, two happy young women admired the sunset, sitting on the high terrace with a cup of coffee. "When are you going to tell your husband about the inheritance?" Chloe suddenly asked, breaking the idyllic silence. "Of course I'll tell him, but not now. Let him work in peace. I don't want to distract him from his business. He'll definitely be in shock." "A pastry chef inheriting a luxurious villa and a pile of money," Grace sighed. "You're not just a pastry chef, you're a culinary artist and a master of your craft. Has he still not come to terms with your profession?" "No." Grace kept her eyes on the seascape. "You know, I noticed a long time ago that your Richard can't stand ordinary people. He looks down on them with contempt. Not everyone can be a businessman. Someone has to cook food and build houses. He himself has forgotten where his business came from. If your father were alive, he wouldn't have allowed the sale of his business for the sake of some gold mines." "Oh, don't even talk about it, Chloe. My heart is not at ease because of this gold venture." Grace stood up from the wicker chair and began to pace nervously. And then Chloe said what only a true friend would say. "Listen, Gracie, don't tell your husband about your aunt's money just yet. He'll just take it from you and sink it into his mines. Let it stay in your aunt's account for now. You can get it when you need it. What if his business fails? At least your inheritance can help you start a new business. I'll keep quiet too. It's a shame we can't hide this house. It's too noticeable." Grace laughed and hugged her friend. A weight lifted from her shoulders. It was nice that someone cared about her. "Thank you, my dear. What would I do without you?" "What would you do? You'd give all the money to that crook and throw the villa at his feet, or sell it on his orders." Chloe clearly disliked Grace's husband. She seemed to hold a grudge against him. "Why do you say that? Tell me what happened." Grace noticed an unkind spark in her friend's eyes. Chloe pressed her lips together and turned away. It was clear she was struggling with the desire to tell or to keep the secret. "Remember when you hosted that big reception and invited me?" Chloe asked. "I remember. It was a year ago." Grace nodded. "Well, I came, and your husband wouldn't let me in." "What?" Grace was shocked. Tears of hurt welled up in Chloe's eyes. She had been holding in her pain for too long. He told me to go back to my hovel and that he wouldn't tolerate another cook smelling of onions. So I left. So that's why you didn't answer my calls. And later said you were sick, took medicine, and fell asleep. Why didn't you tell me, you silly goose? Grace, in a surge of tenderness, hugged her crying friend and stroked her head like a little hurt girl. And what would you have done? Fought with him in the middle of the party, embarrassing yourself in front of his rich friends? Besides, you love him so much. I didn't want to be a source of conflict. That's all, Grace frowned. I won't fight with him. I'll just remember this. Richard has changed. He's become hard and greedy. He sees nothing but profit, and he doesn't see me either. Two women watched the sunset and cried. Happiness had suddenly, imperceptibly, turned into sadness. Grace's heart had sensed trouble for a reason. She didn't know that her husband was currently spending time with Jessica, lavishing tons of money on his mistress, and that evening, dining in an expensive restaurant, he, with a smug grin, handed the beauty a long velvet box. What is this? Jessica eagerly opened the box and gasped. Oh, how lovely. Darling, thank you. You're the best man in the world. And soon, a thick white gold bracelet, studded with large emeralds, was shimmering on her wrist under the cold light of the restaurant's crystal chandelier. The ladies in expensive dresses at nearby tables craned their necks to see the luxurious gift, while their partners cast sharp glances at Richard. But Richard himself was more pleased with himself than ever. I wish this evening would never end, Jessica purred, looking languidly into the eyes of her emboldened companion, and placed her hand on his. Under the envious gazes of the guests, who were showing off their outfits and jewelry to each other, Jessica and Richard left the restaurant and headed for the hotel. Richard was bursting with pride for his luxurious companion. The next day, Richard woke up late. The sun had already heated the sand on the beach, and there were no empty lounge chairs by the huge pool. Jessie, my love, bring me some water. I think I had a bit too much last night. Richard looked with a sour expression at the table, where a couple of empty bottles of expensive champagne stood. Jessica didn't answer and didn't bring any water. Then Richard called out louder, but again, only silence answered him. She went to the beach without me, he sighed, and went to the kitchen himself to open a bottle of mineral water. Suddenly, the lock on the door clicked, and a young maid fluttered into the room like a butterfly, but stopped short upon seeing the guest. Oh, haven't you checked out yet? Richard's jaw dropped in surprise. Why would I? My room is booked for another 3 nights. The maid's already large eyes widened even more. But your companion said that you were both checking out this morning and got a refund for the room, she stammered. What? Richard rushed to the closet. Jessica's things were gone, as were her suitcases. Not understanding anything, he went down to the lobby in his bathrobe and found the hotel manager. Yes, that's correct, the manager confirmed, looking at the computer screen. The room is listed as vacant. Although, wait, it's just been booked again, so I must ask you to leave in half an hour. How can that be? I'm standing right here in my bathrobe. Give me another room, Richard yelled, attracting the attention of the tourists. I'm sorry, but all our rooms are currently occupied, the manager stated flatly, and went about his business. And Richard, under the surprised gazes of the people, had to return to his room and hastily pack his things. No matter how many times he called Jessica, her phone number was unavailable, and the heartbroken lover had to return home earlier than he had planned. At home, 2 pieces of news awaited Richard, one good and one bad. The good news was that he could now relax at his wife's luxurious villa. The bad news caught him completely off guard. What do you mean there's no gold on the plot? Where did it go? What are you talking about? He screamed hysterically when his assistant came to his house late in the evening to report on his business trip. Are you sure you went to the right place? You didn't mix it up? No, I didn't make a mistake, the assistant replied wearily, and sat down in an armchair. I warned you that you needed to check everything thoroughly first, but instead of helping, you were gawking at that girl, and then you just took off with her to the islands. Keep your voice down. My wife will hear, Richard hissed. How did this happen? Those documents were fake, and the photos they showed you don't match reality," the assistant said hoarsely. "You've been had, boss, and very professionally. All I found in the old abandoned mine was a broken cart and a rusty pickaxe. We've been scammed." "How could this happen?" Richard screamed, and Grace came running at his cry. "They showed me a piece of gold and a certificate." "I'm bankrupt." "Bankrupt!" Richard, pushing away a stunned Grace, ran to call Arthur, the former owner of the gold mines. But, just as with Jessica, the swindler's number was unavailable. The certificate wasn't real, and the piece of metal they gave you wasn't gold at all, but iron pyrite. They also call it fool's gold. "So congratulations, boss, you're a fool. You ruined a perfectly good family business." "Shut up!" Richard yelled, turning red and sputtering. "Or I'll fire you." Richard's assistant gave a bitter smile. "I'll quit myself. Better than working with a fool like you. And you, Grace, I sympathize with you. Only a fool like your husband could so incompetently ruin your father's business. Be careful and use your own judgment. Get out." Richard was shaking with rage and was ready to pounce on his deputy. The man left, slamming the door loudly. "Are we really bankrupt?" Grace couldn't believe that her father's profitable business was gone. "Leave me alone. I'm not in the mood for you. I'm tired of it." Richard waved his wife away, who was sitting quietly, her hands pressed to her chest. They didn't speak for the rest of the evening. Grace tried to get through to her husband, but he just snarled and emptied bottle after bottle, rereading Jessica's message over and over again, which she had sent him an hour after his assistant had left. The message knocked Richard off his feet. "How do you like my little revenge, Richie? Does it feel good to be abandoned and deceived by someone you trusted? This is a lesson for you. Don't mess with women, it'll cost you. Don't look for me. I left the country a long time ago. And remember, all that glitters is not gold. And by the way, your bracelet was so-so. I've seen better. Maybe you should stop drinking?" Grace entered the bedroom. "I'm sorry it turned out this way, but life goes on." She wanted to tell him about the money her aunt had left, but she didn't get the chance because her husband didn't let her finish. He simply unleashed all the hatred and anger that had accumulated in his heart on her, blaming his wife for all his sins. "Get out of here, you cow. Go to the kitchen. That's where you belong. If you don't understand business, then at least keep your mouth shut. Not only did I sell the business to swindlers, but I also borrowed a ton of money from loan sharks. Do you know that I mortgaged this house? And they're coming to take it soon because I have no way to pay them?" Grace's legs gave out from what she heard. She leaned against the wall to keep from falling. "Take the house? But it's my house. How could you mortgage it? It was yours. Now it's mine," Richard sneered. "You should have looked at what you were signing. You gave it to me as a gift." "What?" Grace exclaimed. "That's right." Richard, swaying, stood up and was about to raise his hand to his wife, but suddenly his face lit up and he started to dance joyfully, plunging Grace into even greater stupor. "Richard, don't scare me. What's wrong with you?" Grace stared at her husband's unprecedented behavior, who seemed to have completely lost his mind. "I know how I'm going to pay off the debts," he shouted and flopped into a chair. "How?" Grace was glad that her husband had finally calmed down. "I'll sell your aunt's villa. Judging by the photos, it's worth a fortune. Buyers will be easy to find. The main thing is not to sell it for cheap." Richard thought for a moment, calculating something in his head, and then, snapping his fingers, said cheerfully, "Listen, I think after paying off the debt, there will even be some left over for a small business. Brilliant, isn't it?" The smile vanished from Grace's face. She had no desire to sell her dream and the memory of her Aunt Rose. "No, Richard, I'm not selling the villa, and don't even ask," she stated firmly. Richard, feeling his key to financial freedom slipping away, flew into a rage. "How dare you refuse me? You're my wife. You're supposed to help me. And you don't want to sell some shack?" "No, I don't," Grace replied defiantly, glad that she hadn't told him about the secret bank account, which she hadn't yet transferred to her name. "You've already taken my house. Now you want to pocket my inheritance too? Not going to happen, darling. Figure it out yourself. This cook is going to the kitchen because that's my place. And with these words, Grace calmly walked out, having no desire to be near the enraged Richard. Hearing such words from his once submissive wife, Richard sobered up quickly and decided to act differently. He realized that threats and yelling wouldn't force his wife to give up the villa, so he needed to find a more cunning way to compel Grace to sell her inheritance. The next morning, Richard behaved as if the unpleasant conversation about selling the villa and the huge debts had never happened. Grace also remained silent about it. "I'll outsmart you anyway, you stupid hen," Richard thought viciously. For the next few days, he hatched a plan to get his wife's inheritance and then divorce her. Richard still hoped that Jessica would forgive him and come back. His plan was sophisticated and cruel, boiling down to one thing: selling the villa by the sea for the common good right before the divorce and a possible escape abroad. Richard wanted to leave his unsuspecting wife to deal with the debts. However, no matter how much you plan, fate has other ideas. A few days before Richard was about to put his plan into action, he was struck down by a sudden, severe case of tonsillitis. And there he was, the triumphant one, helpless and angry, lying with an IV drip in a private room at the city hospital. Grace, true to her nature, visited him every day. She brought Richard chicken broth, meat soufflé, and freshly squeezed juices, as her husband, spoiled by exquisite food, categorically refused to eat the hospital fare. But despite all the kindness Grace showed him, he was waiting until he felt better to continue his game. 5 days later, Richard's attending physician entered his room. "Well, Richard, I plan to discharge you in 3 days. Any complaints about how you're feeling?" the doctor asked cheerfully. Richard realized that he was running out of time to carry out his vile plan. So, contorting his face as if in pain, he said, "Something's pricking my left side and I feel dizzy. Maybe you could postpone the discharge?" The doctor frowned and examined Richard again, then said thoughtfully, "Strange. All your vitals are excellent, and astronauts would envy your blood pressure. All right, I'll schedule you for additional tests, and we'll hold off on the discharge. Thank you, doctor." Richard was pleased with his small victory, even though it was built on a lie, much like his entire life. Meanwhile, Grace was rushing to her husband after he told her his condition had supposedly worsened. Forgetting the containers of lunch in her hurry, she ran to another wing of the hospital, buying food from the local cafeteria on the way. Throwing open the doors, she burst into the room with a cry, "Darling, I'm here. I've come." And only then did she realize she had entered the wrong room. Grace looked around. The window was open, and on the floor below it lay a small, still old woman, gasping for air. She was clearly unwell, and the elderly woman couldn't call for help. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Grace dropped her bags and ran to the old woman. "I'll help you now." Grace easily lifted the frail body of the elderly woman and carefully placed her on the bed. Doctor, someone's sick in here. Where is that blasted button?" "Ma'am, hang in there." Grace frantically fumbled along the wall and, finding the emergency call button, pressed it with all her might. "Water," the old woman requested, her voice barely audible through her dry lips. Just as Grace managed to give her a drink, a nurse and the same doctor who was treating Grace's husband rushed into the room. "Step aside," he commanded Grace. Grace moved away and watched anxiously as the medics revived the old woman. "Now this is someone who's genuinely sick, not that faker in room 10, the doctor said to the nurse as he gave the old woman an injection. "You're right about that," she confirmed. "You should see how he treats the orderlies, as if they're his slaves. He got himself a private room and thinks everyone should bow down to him." Hearing their words, Grace realized they were talking about her husband. Why did they call him a faker? And if that was true, why would Richard need to do that? She thought. A nurse's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Mrs. Beatrice Thompson would like to speak with you. You came just in time. You saved her. It was her second attack this week. She's a lonely woman. No one visits her. They say her husband died in a lightning strike 20 years ago, and they never had children. Recently, her only nephew passed away. That's what did her in. It's a shame. She's such a bright person." The medics left, and Grace quietly approached the bed where the old woman was sitting, propped up on pillows. "What's your name, dearie?" she asked, smiling gently. Grace's heart skipped a beat. No one had looked at her like that in a long time. The young woman's heart suddenly filled with warmth, and she felt like crying. "I'm Grace. I got the rooms mixed up," she answered, swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat. "I was going to see my husband, the one in room 10, the one the doctor was talking about, the faker." The old woman's eyes twinkled mischievously. It was clear she was feeling much better, as her eyes shone with playful lights. "My name is Beatrice Thompson, but for you, my dear savior, you can just call me Aunt B. Okay, Aunt B?" Grace sat down next to her new acquaintance and took her hand. "Can I visit you? Would you like some homemade soup? I can make some and bring it to you this evening. It will be late, and visiting hours will be over by then." Beatrice's cornflower blue eyes widened in surprise, and the expression on her thin face became so childlike that Grace's heart ached. Before her sat a profoundly lonely person, surprised by such a small gesture. "I would." Grace clapped her hands and, with a deliberately cheerful tone to keep from crying out of pity, said, "Well then, you hang in there, and wait for a home-cooked dinner tonight. And tomorrow I'll come with something very tasty for you. Do you eat everything, or do you have any preferences? The food I have with me now is from the cafeteria. It's not good for you." The old woman's mouth fell open in astonishment, and with a voice choked with emotion, she said, "I eat everything. That's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, gently hugged Beatrice, and ran out of the room, grabbing the bag with the cold food. And the old woman, bewildered and somewhat delighted, remained sitting on the bed, not understanding what had just happened. She couldn't believe that a complete stranger could just take care of her like that. And tears began to flow down her thin wrinkles, dripping onto the hospital blanket. Richard was impatiently waiting for his wife and was already starting to get angry, his stomach rumbling with hunger. "Where have you been? I haven't eaten since lunch. I missed dinner," he shouted at Grace instead of a greeting. "Well, that's a shame. They were serving steamed fish with vegetable stew today." "I asked the nurses," Grace replied, hurriedly unloading containers of food from the hospital cafeteria. Richard pounced on the food, chomping and scattering crumbs. "Now this is more like it, not like the stuff I get here," he said with his mouth full. "Bring me a cup of coffee next time, too." "Got it? They're keeping me here for another week. My situation must be bad, so try to feed your husband better." "Got it," Grace replied, suppressing a laugh, having realized that Richard, who looked healthier than she did, was just being picky to show his importance. After a hearty dinner from the cafeteria, Richard went to sleep, making his wife promise to bring him a thermos of brewed coffee. After a hasty goodbye, Grace rushed home, mentally going over recipes for delicious and healthy soups. 3 hours later, Beatrice, her eyes closed in pleasure, was eating a creamy dumpling soup that Grace had prepared for her with so much love. The next day, after a quick visit to her perpetually dissatisfied husband, whose arrogance was becoming difficult for both doctors and patients to bear, Grace headed to Beatrice's room. She was already waiting for her and broke into a smile upon seeing Grace. "How are you feeling, Aunt B?" Grace asked warmly and hugged the patient. The old woman flinched at her words and joyfully replied, "I'm well, dearie. Thanks to you, I have a reason to live again, and your soup works miracles. I haven't eaten anything so delicious in a long time. It's a masterpiece. What do you do for a living, my dear?" "I'm a chef at a restaurant," Grace answered, blushing. "Why are you blushing? Are you embarrassed?" the old woman asked, surprised. "Yes, my husband says I'm an embarrassment to him because I work as a cook. He's a businessman. He could be the president for all I care." Beatrice exclaimed, clenching her fists. "It's wonderful when a person loves their job, and you're right where you belong. Don't listen to anyone. You should start your own business. You'd get rich on that dumpling soup alone." "Did you bring me food again?" Grace nodded happily, and Beatrice clapped her hands. "Eat with me, for company." "We can talk," the old woman suggested. And Grace, although not hungry, didn't dare to refuse, having a small bite with her new friend. They laughed a lot, talked, telling each other about their lives, cried, feeling sorry for each other, then laughed again. In short, they acted as if they had known each other for 100 years. "Visiting hours are over," said the same nurse who had told Grace about the old woman's difficult life, peeking into the room. "Oh, Just 5 more minutes, Lucy, dear, Beatrice pleaded with a childishly plaintive voice. All right then. The nurse smiled and closed the door. They sat like that for another whole hour. As she was leaving, Grace promised that they would definitely meet again, and the old woman seemed to blossom, as if she had found a new meaning in life. That night, Grace slept like a baby, happy to have found a kindred spirit. But Beatrice, unlike her young friend, whom she had already adopted as her granddaughter, couldn't sleep a wink. She replayed in her mind the phrases Grace had casually dropped, which showed that her life with Richard was unhappy and one-sided. The wise woman understood that the husband didn't love Grace but was simply using her to make his life easier. And Grace didn't notice. Only in the early morning, as dawn broke outside the window, was Beatrice able to fall asleep, having firmly decided to talk to her friend's husband to somehow explain to him that he held a real treasure in his hands. Richard, too, was awake, looking for ways to pressure his wife to sell the villa as soon as possible. And then a name came to his mind, which made Richard shudder and grimace. The person he remembered was called Jackal Joey. He was an old acquaintance from some shady dealings at the very beginning of Richard's difficult career. No one knew that these two had made their first capital through dishonest means. Jackal, that you? Richard immediately dialed the number of his old acquaintance. Long time no see, Richard. I'd never forget that annoying voice of yours, the Jackal laughed hoarsely. I go by Mr. Thompson now. Why are you calling? Something happened. I have a job for you, Mr. Thompson. Want to earn some money? Richard replied and explained how to find him. After a short conversation, Richard hung up and breathed a sigh of relief. There was no turning back now, as the Jackal was involved. And that guy never let go of what was his. After lunch, Beatrice, with the encouraging approval of the nurses and leaning on a cane, headed to Grace's husband's room. But just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard men's voices and stopped, hesitating to enter. Now you understand what you have to do. My stupid wife mustn't suspect a thing. Beatrice froze in fear at the door. She realized that the ingratiating, slightly nasal voice belonged to Grace's husband. But who is the second one? Yeah, I get it. The second voice, hoarse and rough, answered mockingly. I'll scare your little lady, tell her to pay off her husband's debts, and for good measure, I'll leave a couple of bruises. Do what you want. Just make her sell the villa, and then I'll divorce her immediately. And you, Jackal, don't forget that your share is 1/10 of the villa's sale price. I won't forget, don't you worry. The second one smirked. I'll get to your little fish tonight. Expect me in 2 hours with good news, my friend. Beatrice, with a sudden burst of strength, jumped back from the door as if scalded, nearly knocking over an orderly, and at that moment, the Jackal emerged from the room. He was a menacing-looking, tall, bald man with a hard gaze and a heavy jaw, looking like a gangster from the 90s. He walked with a springy gait, swinging keys in his hand, and quickly headed for the exit of the department, spitting heartily into a trash can on his way. My God, how horrible! I need to warn Grace immediately, the old woman thought frantically, and scurried back to her room in small steps, forgetting her cane by the wall. Beatrice's call surprised Grace. She was tearfully begging her to come, and the sooner the better. Asking Chloe to cover for her, Grace rushed to the hospital. When she entered the old woman's room, she asked, "Did anyone follow you?" What? Grace laughed. I'm asking if anyone was watching you, Beatrice exclaimed, and quickly closed the door behind her, motioning for her to speak quietly. Grace was seriously scared, thinking to herself that the old woman had lost her mind. But how she regretted it later when she learned the truth about her husband. How could he? Set a thug on me, and then rob me blind and divorce me, the scoundrel. Fury was boiling inside Grace. Hush, my dear, Beatrice calmed her. I've already thought it all through, and I have a plan. I have some good acquaintances. They'll help. We'll outsmart your husband. You still don't know a lot about me, honey. They picked the wrong grandma to mess with. For starters, take the keys to my apartment. Don't go home. And don't tell your husband where you're living. Grace fell silent and looked at the old woman in surprise. She stood with a look of full determination. When the old woman told her the plan, Grace smiled. Well, Aunt B, you're really something. You bet, the old woman replied, hands on her hips and laughing. It was clear that this situation had invigorated her and given her strength. That day and the next, Grace didn't visit her husband and didn't answer his calls. As she had arranged with Beatrice, she appeared before Richard with a sad expression and, in response to his complaints, told him straight to his face, "Richard, I don't want you to be angry with me and think I'm selfish. I sold the villa to a foundation, and the money is already in my account. You have no idea how much I didn't want to do this, but it's all for you, my dear." And Grace, for good measure, shed a tear. The magazine even fell from Richard's hands. His face spread into a predatory smile of a victor, and greed flashed in his eyes. He looked so much like a predator. How could I not have seen what kind of person was with me all these years? Grace shuddered at the thought, and shivers ran down her spine. "That's good," he purred. "You did well, Grace. You're a true friend. But don't be offended, okay? It's not you, it's me. I'm filing for divorce today. I don't love you anymore. Just don't make a scene. We're in a hospital." Richard barely concealed his joy under a mask of remorse that wasn't actually there. Grace remembered Aunt Bea's words. She had warned her it would be like this. She's so smart. How lucky I am to have met her, Grace thought with relief. And to her husband, she said, "I won't make a scene. See you in court, dear." "And that's it?" Richard exclaimed. "You're not even going to cry and beg me not to leave you?" "No," she answered curtly, and walked out of the room, practically a free woman, leaving Richard standing with his mouth open. And sometime later in court, the lawyer that Beatrice, who turned out to be the head of a small investment fund, had hired for Grace, refuted Richard's claims that his wife had sold her inheritance. The enraged ex-husband's screams about being duped only amused Grace, somehow softening the bitterness of her resentment. In reality, Beatrice had helped Grace stage the sale of the villa so that Richard would believe he had won. And the fake victor left the courtroom with nothing, finding himself in debt not only to the loan sharks, but also to the jackal, who had amicably started a running tab for him. Grace didn't try to take back the house that had once belonged to her parents, which he had deceitfully signed over and mortgaged for his debts. She now had her maiden name back, and a new life had begun, without a husband, but in a villa by the sea, and with a large sum of money from her aunt's account. When Grace entered the house on the hill and looked at the blue of the endless sea from her terrace, she realized she had found her place, and the tension of the last few years fell from her shoulders. Grace sat down in an armchair and watched the waves with pleasure. She was happy that she hadn't sold the villa and had gotten rid of her deceitful husband so easily, preserving her dignity. "Do you still want me to live here, granddaughter?" Beatrice came up silently and hugged her adopted granddaughter's shoulders. "I really do, Grandma," Grace answered quietly and smiled. "I'm so happy, my dear," the old woman whispered through tears. "I dreamed of having a granddaughter so much. What did I do to deserve this happiness?" "Your kind heart, Grandma," Grace answered. "Let me put this blanket on you. It's getting chilly. Make yourself comfortable in the chair, and I'll bring us some hot tea with scones." "With clotted cream?" Beatrice asked joyfully, like a child. "Yes, with your favorite." The old woman beamed with a blissful smile and stayed on the terrace, listening to the cry of seagulls and the sound of the waves. She was determined to be a pillar of support for Grace, and to strictly ensure that no other calculating person would ever disturb the peace of her granddaughter and her home by the sea. And what about Richard? Before he could even celebrate his new bachelor life, numerous creditors reminded him of his debts. Leaving everything behind, the failed businessman fled abroad, hoping to find Jessica there, who had no need for him. And Grace quit her job and opened a small cafe right on the waterfront, not far from her house on the hill. The name of the cafe was simple: On the Shore. A year of living by the sea flew by unnoticed for Grace. Her cafe flourished, and the morning sound of the waves and the cries of eternally hungry seagulls replaced the street noise of the big city and her husband's false smiles. Grace breathed freely, having become the mistress of her own destiny, and felt happy, although sometimes she felt a little sad and lonely, especially when families came to the cafe and had a fun time. "It's time for you to think about getting married." Beatrice approached Grace, who was sadly watching one such noisy family. "Otherwise, you'll get used to being single, and that's a bad habit, you know. I'd be happy to get married, but to whom? I don't see any suitors on the horizon, Grace sighed, and I don't need another one like Richard for anything. That's true, Beatrice agreed. Well, if someone not like him shows up, give me a whistle. Okay, Grace laughed. She loved Beatrice's sharp wit. In the evening, at the height of the cafe's rush hour, when Grace and her assistant didn't have a free moment, a tall man of about 40 with a tanned, weathered face and eyes as blue as the sea walked in. Grace's experienced eye immediately identified him not as a tourist, but as a real sailor. He didn't look rich, but he carried himself with dignity. His direct gaze suggested that this was a man whose words matched his actions. Looking at him, Grace, for some reason, was reminded of the captain from the old movie, The Crimson Sails. The man approached the counter and looked at Grace attentively, which made her blush unexpectedly. "Please pour me the strongest coffee you have," the man asked in such a pleasant, velvety voice that shivers ran down Grace's spine. "Planning on staying up all night, Captain?" Grace decided to joke. "How did you know I'm a captain?" the man asked, surprised. "Just a guess," Grace smiled, and her cheeks turned even redder. "You're right. I have a small vessel, and I'm the captain. It's moored in the next bay, but I've run into some trouble. I lost my anchor." "How did you lose it?" Grace's eyes widened in surprise, and the man smiled. "There was a storm this morning, and the main anchor was lost. Now I need to replace it. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out where to get a good anchor. They're hard to come by these days. My yacht, though not new, was built to last by old masters," the captain sighed. "You could say she's my only friend in life." Grace suddenly felt a strange attraction to this simple and rough-looking man, the complete opposite of her scheming ex-husband. She suddenly wanted to help him. "Here's your coffee, and the Sailor's Delight fish pie is on the house. I came up with the recipe myself. A lot of people like it. Try it." The fish was still swimming in the sea this morning. The man took a bite of the juicy, fragrant pie and closed his eyes in pleasure. "You're a master. So delicious. Someone's lucky to have you as a wife." Grace looked away. "There was one, but I'm divorced," she answered quietly, then added, to change the subject, "There are a lot of fishermen here. They can help you find an anchor." The captain stopped chewing and looked directly at Grace. "To be honest, I'm not just looking for an anchor, but also a place to stay while the repairs are being done." "Do you know anyone who could put me up?" Grace was taken aback, and Beatrice, who had heard the whole conversation and was watching them from the side, coughed delicately, which meant one thing. She was about to intervene. "My dear captain, what is your name, may I ask?" The old woman spoke up. "My name is Aunt Bea, and this is my granddaughter, Grace. And I'm Leo. It's a pleasure to meet you." And Leo kissed Grace's hand. The old woman's sharp gaze didn't miss this grand gesture, nor the fact that Grace was standing there as red as a beet and silent as the fish in the pie, which meant she was flustered. "Leo, we actually have an anchor," Beatrice said, looking slyly at the captain. "It used to be for a small barge. I think it will fit. And we can find a spot for you in the guest house in our yard." "Really?" Leo's eyes turned to Beatrice with an admiring gaze. "Grandma, do we have an anchor?" "Where?" Grace asked, surprised. "Yes. Behind the shed. It's been lying there for a long time. Mr. Jenkins wanted to sell it for scrap metal more than once, but I wouldn't let him. My heart told me it would come in handy. I'll buy it from you." "How much?" Leo asked. "No money needed," the old woman waved her hand. "Instead, you can fix the roof of the guest house. Our Mr. Jenkins keeps meaning to get up there, but he's not as young as he used to be." "Deal," Leo answered, and, with a clear conscience, began to finish his pie, stealing glances at Grace. 2 weeks later, the roof was fixed, and the anchor was in its place. Even the shed, which had long been in need of repair, was put in order by Leo's hard-working hands. Grace enjoyed watching him work with concentration, skillfully fitting new shelves to the walls of the storage room or replacing the rotten logs of the shed's walls. And in the evenings, they would drink tea together, sitting on the seashore and listening to the waves, watching the sunset. In those moments, they talked about their lives, sharing the pain they had both endured. On the last evening before his departure, Leo came to the cafe where Grace worked. I fixed everything, and I have to set sail tomorrow morning. But Grace froze, her heart sinking and stopping. I'd like to stay, so you can teach me how to make that strong coffee, Leo faltered. I've dreamed of finding a place where I could find peace and happiness, to drop my anchor for good. You understand? And have you found that place? Yes. Then stay. And then they were silent, because they understood each other without words. Leo took the coffee pot from Grace's tired hands and went to brew coffee, as strong as his feelings for her. That evening, they sat together again after the cafe had closed, listening to the waves crash against the shore. They understood that their connection was unplanned. Their hearts had just started beating in sync, and their souls had become kindred. After all, those who have once endured a great storm always seek a quiet harbor. And that harbor was found, right in the middle of a small coastal cafe on the shore.